everybody, this is Caitlin here, and welcome back to Card Game Wednesday, the day of the week where we enjoy all things card game related. And today we're doing a kind of a top 5 / discussion / kind of hopes and whatnot for what is going to be in the next cluster, or rather what I hope is going to be, or what I hope is not, and what is going to be in the next cluster. It's kind of like a complicated thing. It's just basically my top 5 hopes for the cluster after Reiya cluster, if they continue to do so, which I think they have planned, and they have stated that they are going to do a cluster after, obviously, Reiya, because there doesn't seem to be any plans of stopping Forcewell, thankfully, thank God. Although I do hope that basically as part of this is that they get their act together in terms of some things that obviously have upset people in the last couple of weeks and everything, from things that have been revealed and all that stuff. So I'm going to dive in and we're going to discuss a couple of things about my top 5 hopes for the cluster after Reiya cluster. There's no actual name for it at the moment, so right now all I'm going to say is the next cluster. That's really all, or like cluster X. So like let's call it something like that, because honestly there's no name for it, so I can't really call it anything yet. And since we have no indication as to what the apparent new character that's going to be basically part of the cluster is, or who it's named after, we have no idea what it's called. So I'm going to just call it cluster X for now, because we have no other thing to call it, and I'd rather not say next cluster constantly, so we'll just call it X cluster or something like that. So my first hope here, my number one, top priority one, is I don't want to go back to Ataratica. So there seems to be a trend here. So all in all, we've had 2 worlds essentially. We got teased way back when Reiya cluster was about to begin that, oh, we're going to a new world with like new races and new creatures and everything like that. And the tease was cool for a little while until we realized we'd been duped and we were not in a different world, we were just in a different timeline, and it was Reearth, aka Grimm's world, all over again. And I didn't like that. It was a bit of like false advertising essentially. They harped on like, oh no, it's a new world and everything and blah blah blah, and you won't be seeing any returning characters. There'll be one. How many returning characters have we had? We've had Scarlet, we've had Lumia, we've had Scheherazade, Reiya potentially. We've had so many returning characters, and it's annoyed me like to heck. I mean, it is cool to see some characters that we've seen before, a little bit slightly reimagined, but I don't want to go back. Essentially, I don't want to have another rehash. I want a new world. I don't want it to end and it's like, oh, we need to go back to Ataratica now and we need to show you what happened before Alice showed up, before Valentina got into power, blah 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 blah. It's like, no, I don't want to see that, because I already know how that story is going to end. We know, because Alice is going to show up, the world's going to get screwed over, Lapis is going to win, and then we're going to head on straight back into Lapis cluster, and it's just going to be this never-ending loop here. So I don't want that. I want an entirely new world, not connected to any of the other worlds. Well, all of 2 worlds that we've had, because we've actually only had 2 worlds, because we're not counting Valhalla cluster, because that's its own hot mess take that we don't actually include into the actual canon story or anything like that. So I want to go to a completely new world. I don't want to go back to Ataratica. I mean, I adore the characters that come from there. I adore Priscilla, obviously. I kind of warmed up to Faria a little bit. I love Maria Bell, Shion, I loved her. Valentina was also a very great villain and everything, but I want something different. I don't want to go back there, and that kind of blends into like part 2 of what I want next. So it because it's kind of the same point, but I broke it down into 2 separate points because I felt like if I made it the one point, I'd be talking about it for far too long. It kind of slides into my number 2 hope that I have, is that I want to experience new characters, not just different versions of the old characters. So essentially, we got teased about the time-spinning witch. We got teased about, hey, here's Scarlet, aka Nyarlathotep. It's like, hey, here's Amiel, aka Lumia. Here's Grim, but a vampire. Here's Dark Red Riding Hood. And it gets to the point where it's like, I'm sick of seeing alternate versions of characters that I already know and love. Give me something new. Like, I was excited to see Shayla and to see Carrick and the Panda King, but they essentially got shafted in their own cluster because they were like, hey, you know what sells? Previous waifus, that's what sells. So in this next cluster, Cluster X, I want to see new characters, not just different versions of old ones. I want to see fresh new ideas. I hope that whoever this new character is that they're teasing for appearing in Reiya cluster and apparently becoming part of like Cluster X and whatnot, I hope they are not just a rehash of an old character. I hope it's a brand new character, not relating to anything from the previous world. So not connected to Reearth, not connected to Earth or Ataratica in the slightest. I don't want to see that. And in this new cluster, I want just new characters, new ideas, new themes, new culture, new lore. I don't want any connection to the old stuff. I don't know if that's too much to ask now. I feel like Force Will like may have felt like they've backed themselves into a corner, that they've built this IP around such recognizable characters. Maybe they were just afraid that nobody would like the new characters from Reiya Cluster, and that's why they were like, hey, remember her? She's got a different name and different powers, and she's evil now. I don't want that for the next cluster. I don't want that for Cluster X, essentially. I want something new and interesting and blah 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 blah. So that's really all I have to say about that second point. So yeah, new characters, new world, new ideas. Don't give me rehashes. That's not what I want. I would just want to see like the people at Force Will show their creativity, show us that yes, they can think of new ideas, and it's not just like a total like, hey, can I copy your homework? Okay, but make sure to change it a little. You know, that kind of old meme that is going about everywhere nowadays. I don't want that, so that would be my number 2 point, which kind of blends into number 1, but I decided to make it a separate point, just because of how similar they were, but I would feel like I would talk about them both for too long if I made them both the 1 point. But then going off here in my number 3 point here is that I don't want the jewel stones to be reprinted, and I'm gonna explain myself here. Now, there's been a lot of debate really about whether or not they should reprint the jewel stones. Obviously, when they got reprinted in CFC, some people had mixed opinions about them. I mean, they already got reprinted in, it was the Valkyria Chronicles, Vingolf. They got reprinted there, but not to the same extent as they got reprinted in Lapis Cluster. Obviously, they pretty much all got reprinted in Curse of the Frozen Casket, and they were pretty much easily readily available. I mean, you could get them in practically almost every pack. I can't tell you how many copies of, I can't remember which version it is. I think it's not Scorched Vales, is it Hearth's Core? It's the blue-red one. I have so many copies of that card, that is unbelievable how many I pulled. But I want them to try and get more creative, because obviously we've seen them do sort of jewel-coloured stones, but they've done really interesting things with them. Like the Scarlet one, essentially, the one where it's like, oh, it normally, like, taps for this color, but if you pay like 200 life, you can tap it for another color, whatever. Like, I want them to be creative. I also like the Despair stone or whatever, where it starts off with one color, but then when you flip your ruler, you can flip the stone and it produces 2 colors. Like, I want them to try creative things like that. I mean, I wouldn't be opposed to them reprinting the shock stones, you know, the counter ones from Vingolf 3, where it's like, hey, it can produce this color twice, and then after that it's producing this one color. I wouldn't mind if they reprinted those, but I don't want them to just straight up reprint the jewel stones, because I think that would just make the game too easy. I want us to challenge ourselves, because I feel like decks like, say, obviously decks like Ayu kind of rely on the jewel colours and whatnot, I feel like a little bit, because obviously it's a one-off deck and you can't really go mono blue for Ayu, because that would be essentially suicide, most likely. But I feel like they need to be a bit more creative, especially when we have like decks forever going 3 to 4 colors sometimes, because they're trying to be heavy control or something like that. So I want them to be a little bit more creative with what they are doing in terms of any kind of stone that's producing more than one color. So I don't want them to straight up reprint the jewel stones. I want them to get creative and try different ideas and whatnot, in terms of like giving us the kind of similar mechanic, but like make it cost like a little bit. Like give us like some kind of caveat for us having to like produce 2 colors in our deck if we want to be that kind of play style where we want more than one color and everything. Other than that, my next point, my number 4 point here, because we're getting near to the end of all the points that I want to make, I would like it if they did something similar to the starter deck rulers for Reiya Cluster. And I know what you're going to say, it's like, oh no, not sealed abilities. No, I want them to have continued support for the rulers. And what I mean by that is that I would like it if they had the continued support for the Star Deck rulers, similar to what they did in Reiya Cluster, because I like the idea of them having at least some sort of support for the Star Deck rulers in each part of the cluster, like in each of the 4 parts. I feel like that would be a great incentive, is to buy the starter decks in the first place, so that not only do you have at least like this ruler that, hey, is like good for learning how to play the game, but you can then go on to make a lot more competitive for the meta once it gets a lot more support in the different sets and everything. Now, I do not want them to be reprinted several times, and I don't want them to have stupid sealed abilities that really don't do anything for the game. It just makes printing them essentially a lot more of a hassle, essentially, and it just makes it so that they go down in value, because it's just oversaturation of the same card, essentially. Oh, it's got a bit of different artwork, but at the same time it's like, it's oversaturation that we really don't need. So I would like it if they even decide to do that, if they make starter decks, which I feel like they will, because they've been pretty consistent about making starter decks for pretty much every cluster, even though for Alice Cluster the kind of like the 7 Kings starter decks came after the cluster, and I'm pretty sure the Fairy and the Melgus ones came before it, like, or at least after Grim Cluster ended. But I would like it if they kind of like made some support and whatnot for starter decks throughout the cluster, and then make them so that they're at least viable. And also, please don't reprint the cards from the starter deck in the main set just so you can fill up slots, because I feel like that's just a waste. If you're going to increase the set size, then do it by actually creating new cards, and don't just reprint cards with like slightly different maybe flavor text or slightly different artwork. I don't think that's like a good use, because it's just like a bunch of cards that you already own, because most of the starter decks are play sets of those cards, so you don't need different versions of them and whatnot. So I hope that they continue to do that. That would be a great idea, personally, I think, if they continue to support the rulers from the starter decks and everything like that, keep up with those themes going throughout, and I think that would be like a great way to incentivize like more new people to join the game, because obviously when the starter decks come out, that's usually a good kicking point to try and welcome new players into the game. So I think that would be a great way to try and like encourage people to start playing Force of Will by using the continued support and whatnot, and the, you know, the enticement of like these starter deck rulers that are going to be viable for the future and not just for that first month when there's no other cards for the set. And then finally, and this is probably more a big gripe with, say, the company themselves and their kind of plan and whatnot for sets than it is to do with whatever the next cluster is, but I want them to fix the ruler ratios. I was very, very upset, obviously, when we got down to, it was essentially, I believe, if I can think off the top of my head, the start of Reiya cluster. I'm pretty sure that was when, at that point, they were like, hey, you're only going to get one ruler per box, as opposed to the 2 that we got in Lapis cluster. I can't remember at what point in Alice cluster you stopped getting at least 4 rulers in a box. I missed that time really greatly. I missed it when you could get like the majority of the rulers in your box for what you paid for, and I don't like this idea that they're coming up with. It's like, hey, your chances of getting rulers is more randomized. It's like, no, I do not agree with that. I want them to at least fix ruler ratios so that they are, 1, pullable in your box and not like a mystery, like there's like a chance that you don't even pull a ruler at all. That makes it less incentivized to even buy a box. Like, why would you do that? It just seems like such a stupid reason. And on top of that, I want them to hopefully fix the ratios where it's like, hey, you are at least guaranteed 2 rulers in your box, because that's really what you should be guaranteed. Because literally, there's so many rulers that I don't have from Reiya cluster already, just because you can only get 1 of them in the box, and for the majority of the cluster, the secret rare was just a reprint of a ruler that we already had, aka from the starter decks. I don't like that mentality, and I don't like that tactic. It just feels like a cheap and nasty way of making us buy more product. Like, I feel like this game originally started out as ones that you could easily afford, that you could get into, and you know, when they start putting rulers behind paywalls, when they start reducing your chances of pulling a ruler in the first place, it's like, hey, thanks for printing all the support for ruler that I'll never pull because they're not guaranteed in the box, or you're very unlikely to pull them. I don't like that. I feel personally that it's a very scummy move, and I don't like it at all. I hope that they realize this mistake, and that they realize, hey, the people really, really, really don't like that, because they seem to have heard our outcry about the whole Kaguya situation. They put up like a very brief post. They never actually explained how they were going to fix it, whether or not they would fix it. They said, oh, we understand people's outrage or their outcry towards this, and they were going to find some way to get Kaguya out to as many people as possible. But that doesn't really answer any of my questions and whatnot, so I really hope that for Cluster X, or whatever we're going to be calling it in the future, they fix ruler ratios and they basically scrap this stupid idea of randomizing your chances of pulling rulers, because they are an essential part of the game. Like, yeah, it was great when you took magic stones out of the packs and they're just included in the box. That was great. You know what's not great? Not pulling a ruler in your box after you've paid a lot of money for it, because it's not cheap to buy a box. Like, it certainly is not, especially after they put the price up after the set increased. And what did they do with the set increase? But they reprinted a bunch of stuff is what they did. So basically that's my thoughts for my final point. I want them to fix the ruler ratios and just fix the set ratios in particular, because it feels like this increase of the set size that they did for the majority of Reiya cluster didn't really help at all, because a lot of the cards were just reprinted from the starter deck, or a lot of them were just duds that really wouldn't see play at all, essentially. I feel like, yes, it was encouraging for draft, but at the same time, it's like, nobody's going to play a draft if, like, the cards are not worth the payment of playing a draft. I don't understand, but I hope you enjoyed this list, guys, of my top 5 hopes for the next cluster, aka Cluster X, aka it doesn't have a name yet, so I'm not going to be sure what to call it. But I hope you enjoyed this video, guys. Leave a comment down below as to what you hope will come out of the next cluster. Do you want to see any of the suggestions that I made? Do you want a new suggestion or whatever? Are you wanting the return of Vingolf? Because obviously we haven't had a Vingolf since we got the Lost Tome starter deck. Do you want Vingolf to return, or do you want something else in particular? Do you want to see a certain like creature race to appear in Force of Will in the next cluster? Leave a comment down below, guys, and let me know what you think, because I always appreciate you leaving your comments and letting me know what you guys think of these ideas. And until next time, guys, I will see you all later. This video was made possible thanks to patrons such as Houston Moore, Alucard, and Craig McCutcheon.